Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. Today, we have another set of great stories about crazy people. The first story about a neighbor, Karen, who wanted to demolish the garden, which is more than 100 years old. But before we start, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. B-word tries to destroy my orchard. I bankrupt her and get her house torn down. Well, let's start a few years in the past. My great-grandparents planted an orchard. It's now at least 120 years old. My grandparents and my parents were really proud of the peach trees growing in it and did their best to keep them in good health and well. We always threw a big party when the peaches were ready to be harvested and invited all of our friends and neighbors to it. I love those parties. The neighbors on the property to the south of our orchard were particularly fond of our peaches. They were a bunch of fine old people, and me and the old man Sam were pretty good friends. He taught me a lot about woodworking with hand tools only, and we had some great evenings in his workshop. We finished many a good whiskey in there together. In return, he got a lot of fine peaches, marmalade, homemade peach liquor, etc. Sadly, he died a good 10 years ago. Cancer's a real a-hole. His wife followed soon after. Many suspected it was of a broken heart. They had no kids, so all of their property was left to the state, except his tools and whiskey collection, which he had gifted me a few weeks before he died. In comes Karen. The name speaks for itself. Haircut, attitude, bitchiness, the whole deal. She bought the property of my late neighbors. We hadn't had the kind of money to buy it at that time, as we had some dire straits the years before and all of our savings were gone. The first thing she did, before actually moving in, was go around and make demands of the neighbors on the surrounding properties. When it was finally our turn to listen to her gibberish, she told me that we needed to remove half of the trees as the leaves were blowing onto her property. We told her in a polite way that we won't comply to those demands, as the orchard is a vital part of our family heritage, tradition, and life, and has been there for at least 120 years. She was pretty PO'd, but didn't do anything for the time being. There are a few things you need to know before I continue with the story. The workshop I mentioned before was situated right at the border to our property. It was a small timber-framed building, at least 160 to 180 years old. The regulations in my state are pretty strict concerning old structures. Every structure over 100 years is protected, and you need special permission to tear it down. Failing to get this permission can lead to a hefty fine. To get the permission to build a new building, it has to be up to code, and you have to ask your surrounding neighbors, and if they agree, you're good to go. Except there's one specialty in my county. You have to keep a certain distance to the border of the property to allow emergency services full access to your property. If one of these requirements isn't met, the building is illegal, or at least only partially legal, and can be ordered by court to be torn down. That might come in handy later. So back to my Karen. After our first encounter with her, she did her best to pester the whole neighborhood. She got the neighbor's dog put down because he allegedly attacked her brat. It later turned out she faked the attack. The dog was one of the sweetest and most innocent dogs you could ever imagine. A Bernese mountain dog. Big, but a real teddy bear. Anyway, she later got us to stop doing our annual peach parties, as she called the police every time for various reasons. Noise complaints, we had a band playing there in the afternoon. Arson, we lit a fire in a designated fire pit in the middle of our property. She called the ATF on us for allegedly making moonshine. My dad had a license to distill for our own consumption. In short, she was a real pain in the bum, and after 3 years, we decided it wasn't worth it to deal with various officers and law enforcement agencies every time we threw the party, and we decided to quit. After she'd reached this goal, she resorted to pestering us to remove the orchard. We didn't cave in. And some things started to get really fishy. Somehow the tires of our trucks got slashed. Eggs got thrown at our farmhouse. Our cat disappeared and surfaced a few days later in pretty rough condition. It looked like somebody had tried to cut his tail off. Don't worry, he healed up completely, but we actually couldn't prove that she did all that. Then came the day that she made her biggest mistake. She had a company come in a sort of secret operation and tear down the old woodworking workshop overnight. 2 days later, they started building a big garage/recreational center/house right where the shop was. But she missed one fine detail, which got pretty important later on. She didn't ask for our permission, nor the neighbors. A short while after, the trees right next to her property started to get sick. The leaves turned brown in the middle of summer, and the branches started to die. We lost 4 trees before we figured out the cause. Somebody had driven long copper nails into them. We had a suspicion but couldn't prove it, so we put up some trail cameras. Perfectly legal as it was our own property. We caught her red-handed. My dad confronted her, she apologized, and my dad, being the way too nice guy he is, wanted to let her get off the hook, but not me. The nail she drove into our oldest tree was the final nail in her coffin. I started to investigate. I had some friends at the administration of our county and asked them to do some inquiries. Turned out she hadn't applied for permission to tear down the old shop, nor for permission to build a new building. I further did some inquiries on the border of our property. Turned out the old markers vanished over time, and her building was about 3 feet onto our property. After I'd gathered all this information, I presented it to my parents. At first, they were reluctant, as they didn't want to start a neighborhood clash. But after I recounted all the things that she did to us and our neighbors, they were in. So let the games begin. First, we called the authorities on her for tearing down a protected building and presented them with all the evidence we gathered. Then we called the building authorities on her for building a building without permission, not up to code, and not only didn't she keep the required distance to the property border, she actually built on our property without our permission. Long story short, turns out the workshop hasn't always been protected because of its age, but also because it was a historical landmark, which played a vital role in a conflict back in the 1860s. She got sued for this and had to pay a fine, the equivalent of about $150,000. She further had to demolish her newest built building, costing an additional $50,000, and got fined for this too, about $83,000, and had to rebuild the workshop at her own expense, which was another whopping $154,000, as it had to be period correct up to the smallest detail. Means it had to be built with the correct materials, with hand tools only, and to the correct dimensions. As you can imagine, paying professionals to build quite a large timber-framed building only by hand gets pretty expensive pretty fast. So all in all, it cost her an equivalent of $437,000, plus further expenses like lawyers, etc. This caused her to go bankrupt, so she had to sell the property in the end, which my parents bought, by the way. Last I heard of her, she was moving back to the big city. And our second story. Yell at me and my staff? Fine. Good luck running the office on your own. I used to work in a small family-owned doctor's office. A couple years in, they got a legal fight and experienced staff started leaving. Being young and dumb, I wanted to be loyal and ended up managing half of the doctor's office. The other half was managed by Brittany. She had a team of 3 that did the work of 6. The company got bought and a new owner came in. He was like a Danny DeVito in gold chains with a bad toupee. He was dumb and no one respected him. He screamed constantly about little things at anyone. He micromanaged and didn't bother to understand someone's job before telling them how to do it better. He tried to streamline processes without knowing how they worked, but mostly he yelled. One day, the hardest working person in the entire clinic, a nurse who started every appointment, was a few minutes late. She was a single mother and her kid was sick, so she showed up less than 10 minutes later than usual. Danny proceeded to berate the nurse in front of the entire office, screaming about dumb things like being a few minutes late, then a strange thing like how she wrote dates, then absurd things like how her bedside manner sucked. She'd gotten flowers the day before from a patient because she was so good. When the nurse put in her notice at the end of the day, Danny fired her on the spot, told her to leave, and never come back. I'd been job searching and had actually gotten an offer. I was planning on giving a lot of notice, but couldn't give notice if I'd be fired immediately. I had student loans and was living paycheck to paycheck. I grabbed the 2 remaining members of the admin staff and explained that I was going to quit without notice before too long. Brittany understood and said she too was in the final stages of taking a new job. We agreed that we would quietly all find new jobs and duck out when it was convenient. We had to quietly let all the other staff know, and each of us started quietly smuggling our personal effects out of the office. I had a start date 2 weeks out, but honestly couldn't give notice without risking my financial health. A week or so later, Danny started screaming about the color of tape I'd used to duct tape down a power cable months before. I'd used orange and yellow to make it more visible, but Danny said that was unprofessional. I asked him how he'd like me to fix it. Danny: "Well, that's not my problem, that's yours." I paused for a second and said, "You know, I don't think it is my problem. I'm out." I grabbed my small box of desk things as Danny howled at me. "Danny, you'll never find another job in this town. I own every doctor's office in this county. I don't need you since I've got Brittany." Brittany looked at him and said, "You know, I've been meaning to tell you that today's my last day." We packed our things and walked out. As Danny called the cops, saying his employees were stealing things like their own birthday cards and pictures of their kids. We texted the third employee who was on lunch and explained what happened. It sounds like she didn't go back. And without front desk, billing, or nursing staff, a doctor's office simply can't run. I'm told they were closed for almost 2 weeks before they got temporary employees, but had no one to train them. Danny shuttered and resold the business a few months later to the big dog in the industry, which is a charity. Since their books are open, we saw that they bought the company, really just the clients list, for about 15% less than what Danny had paid a few months prior. Edit. Bit more information. The police did show up, and one of the officers who responded was a patient we'd treated for months. Weeks later, Danny tried to withhold our final paychecks, claiming that we forfeited wages if we didn't give notice, illegal, and that we'd stolen valuable intellectual property. He meant the passwords. He didn't know anyone's user IDs or passwords, so he had to pay an external IT team to get all of our files. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.